So if I was in your shoes, I would be wondering how the three of us ended up doing research and writing about Chandigarh's modernist furniture. So we're going to give the very short version of this story. This project started on our master's course when Nia showed images to Gregor and myself of a selection of furniture, one item you can see here, that she had bought from a government factory sale in Bangalore. About a year later, when I was doing research for the Victoria and Albert Museum's furniture department on their Chandigarh chairs, I was reminded of the pieces in Nia's living room. To my relatively untrained eye, there seemed to be quite a few stylistic similarities between the pieces. So I consulted with Nia, and then we both turned to Gregor for a more expert opinion on the construction and the forms of the two sets of furniture. Talking as a group, a storm of questions started to brew. What was the relationship, if any, between the chairs in Nia's house and those in the museum's storage? How had the museum pieces become so famous and so expensive? And why those pieces instead of the suspiciously similar ones sitting in Nia's living room? The more research we undertook and the more conversations we had with each other, the more questions we had. And it's through this increasingly long list of questions that our Chandigarh Chairs project was born.
So today we're going to talk to you and hopefully with you about our ongoing Chandigarh Chairs project, on what we found and what's still missing, and how we're approaching this design history project. Through this, we're also going to make a pitch to you on how we think design and architectural history are relevant and perhaps even necessary components of your work as practicing architects and designers, and on why looking back and engaging critically with the past is a necessary part of envisioning and manifesting the future. Quite a few of the talks and publications that we've done on this project have been for a European or a North American audience. And in these talks, these previous talks, we've usually given a very brief history of the Indian Punjab and partition, and on the development and construction of Chandigarh. Although we're sure that you're all much more knowledgeable about these historical elements than a lot of our usual audiences, we think it's a little, we think that a little extra history and a little extra context can't hurt before we jump into the core of this talk. So as you already may know, the city of Chandigarh was built from the ground up as the new capital globally for its city technical BPA. In the last 2 decades, the utilitarian modernist furniture created for the city has received increasing international media and market attention. And once used in government and university buildings, much of the furniture has been removed from Chandigarh since the 1990s and can now be found in the homes of the rich and famous in the global north. The most prominent example of this being the US celebrity family, the Kardashian clan. So when we went into design history, we definitely didn't expect to be reading tabloids and looking at celebrity Instagram accounts for research, but here we are. Our project has highlighted just how little scholarly work has been undertaken regarding the design, production, and use of Chandigarh's modernist furniture pieces, despite the international fame of Chandigarh's architecture and soaring prices for its modernist furniture. The research and writing on the furniture which has been done appears to have been predominantly undertaken by dealers and auctioneers before being repeated in the popular design press. And we found that these writings in big, expensive, and image-filled books generally propose a pretty similar narrative of Chandigarh's furniture, a narrative that we believe is both incomplete and partially incorrect. So these authors and volumes generally suggest that the furniture is designed by Pierre Jeanneret in the 1950s, that it wasn't properly appreciated in India. In the 1990s, French dealers traveled to India and quote unquote saved the furniture from being destroyed. These dealers removed Chandigarh's furniture to Europe, had pieces restored, wrote a book on them and exhibited them widely across cities like Paris, London, and New York. And the furniture is now appreciated, as it should be, in museums and interiors in the global north, and has gained its rightful place in the European design canon. So this is generally what these authors and volumes suggest. The creation and popularization of this narrative rests on the work of two French dealers who first removed the furniture from India. Through access to capital and professional networks in Europe and North America, they were able to purchase an unspecified amount of furniture in Chandigarh and disseminate this particular narrative of its creation through exhibitions in prestigious and respected private galleries. Soon after, the same dealers sold the furniture in public auctions, where their narrative remained unchallenged and was spread more widely among the design press, where it's generally still repeated without criticism now. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, the narrative and history developed through these writings appears to have been crafted and spread with the specific intention of increasing the financial value of Chandigarh's chairs. As such, there's some large and very glaring omissions and distortions within the widely known historical account, which may have helped increase the sale value of these objects. Most notably, the dealer's history emphasizes the involvement of people, primarily straight, white, Christian men, whose work is already well documented in design historical writing, and which already fetches large sums of money at auction. Putting Chandigarh's then relatively unknown furniture up for auction with the backing of big-name designers such as Le Corbusier increases the chances of it selling for more money, whether that attribution was accurate or not. However, this market-driven focus on the role of white male Western architects, namely Pierre Jeanneret and Le Corbusier, has meant that the role of the rest of the Indian design team has been minimized or erased. The process of manufacturing the furniture and the stories of those involved in making the pieces is completely absent, as are the details of the furniture's long history of use within Chandigarh and dissemination of the Chandigarh design throughout India. The purpose of our project then is to counteract this profit-driven narrative, addressing falsehoods and beginning to fill gaps in the literature surrounding the design, production, and use of Chandigarh's modernist furniture. Specifically, we're looking to uncover the Indian design history of Chandigarh's modernist furniture, especially in terms of its production and use. But beyond this, we're also interested in exploring and detailing the furniture's more recent consumption and how the organization and operation of art markets in Western Europe and North America have molded popular and scholarly understandings of these pieces of modernist design, and what can be done to counter these forces.
Our project so far has explored a couple of different areas of research, addressing gaps in the existing narrative and challenging the structures that have permitted and perhaps even encouraged its creation and spread. We recognize the extreme importance of on-the-ground research in Chandigarh, of interacting with furniture we're studying and the people and the places who are so important to its design, use and production. But unfortunately, we started this project just as the pandemic began, which has meant that so far, the bulk of our work has been secondary, looking into two big categories of available material. First, we've taken a dive into the currently available literature on Chandigarh's furniture, looking at the design press and interiors websites and information put out by the dealers and auction houses who have been involved in selling these pieces on the international stage. We've been very fortunate that these materials have included items contemporary to the construction of Chandigarh, which has highlighted and hinted at more extensive involvement of the entire design team than the dealers and the auction houses might have led us to believe. We've also spent far too many hours tracking the international auction of Chandigarh's furniture through materials publicly available on the websites of major auction houses like Sotheby's, Christie's, Rago and Wright, as well as several others. We've then compiled all of this data, which includes predicted prices, sale prices, attributed designer, provenance, bibliographies, descriptions, and photographs into one truly giant spreadsheet, which we've made publicly on our website, publicly available, sorry, on our website for anyone who wants to access it. All of this information has given us a sneak peek into the way in which the furniture has been sold and the processes through which auctioneers and dealers have repositioned Chandigarh's furniture as European for their own financial gain. Of course, we've also had to actually do something with all the information that we've collected and all the thoughts that we've had. And at the beginning of this project, our talks and articles focused on unpacking, critiquing the exploitative ways in which Chandigarh's furniture was removed and rebranded. Through these presentations and conversations with audiences in Europe and in India, we've made some amazing connections, collating even more information about the furniture's continued use throughout Chandigarh itself. And in turn, this new information has allowed us to engage more thoroughly with all the moral and ethical questions surrounding the furniture and its recent journey. More recently, this has brought us into the field of art and antiquities crime, another area we never thought we'd find ourselves in. Exploring the similarities between the journey of Chandigarh Chairs and other pieces of art, smuggled or otherwise questionably moved out of their places of origin. And while most of our output has been talks at academic conferences, we've also spoken more publicly during talks hosted by the Bengaluru International Centre, in interviews by the press, as well as in more alternative outputs like a really cool zine that Nia designed recently.
But why do this at all? Why should anyone care about the history of designed objects, whether they're designers or historians or members of the general public? What's the so what, as one of my middle school teachers always used to ask, of this project, and in fact the whole design historical field? As we mentioned a few minutes ago, we're going to use the next 30 minutes or so to make a pitch to you on how we think design and architectural history aren't just relevant, but perhaps are even necessary components of your work as practicing architects and designers, and why looking back at the past is a necessary part of envisioning and manifesting a good and just and equitable future. And we're going to do this by looking at what's happened with the Chandigarh furniture and three big issues that we've seen coming up time and time again in the world of design, in the world of design history, and in this particular project. And those are attribution, use, and context.
The first concept we're going to touch on today is attribution, namely who gets credit for work once it's complete, and what are the deeper meanings and consequences of this type of attribution. There are a couple of ways in which the current and historic setup of design practices, the ways they operate, and the ways that they're written about, can create problems around attribution. The process of designing and creating an object, whatever it might be, especially an object for mass production, is usually undertaken by more than one person. This then entails some division of labor, both among designers and between designers and those making the object. Dividing the work means that the authorship of a particular object is no longer clearly linked to one single person. And despite this, projects are often retroactively credited to a single figure at the expense of everyone else. Sometimes this is the result of hierarchies, which place one single designer at the head of a studio. Sometimes it's because such designers actively credit only themselves. And at other times, it's because a lack of credit to anyone else leaves the space open to assign it to a single person. Either way, the desire to credit work to one single designer happens because of the value that's placed on the conception of an idea over its execution, and the status of being the individual who came up with the idea and held that knowledge. But we'd suggest that it's also the result of who tends to be writing design histories, and therefore who it is that has a stake in increasing the status of designers. And by this, we're referring to designers. Designers often write design histories. And finally, we'd suggest that it's increasingly the result of how markets for art and design operate around the financial value that can be assigned to works of individual well-known designers. In the case of Chandigarh's furniture, it's the Swiss-French architect Pierre Jeanneret who's been positioned and written into the history as the exclusive designer of many of the pieces of furniture created for the city of Chandigarh, despite the well-known fact that he worked within a predominantly Indian team of designers and architects, as you can see from this picture. Beyond the team of designers, many other people played a part in the creation of Chandigarh's furniture, not least the carpenters and cane weavers who actually made the objects. Along with many of the designers involved, their contributions have also been ignored in the way the object's history is usually retold. And interestingly, furniture designed by Pierre Jeanneret in Europe was not highly sought after during his lifetime. And though he was respected as an architect, we might ask why it's his name alone that's come to define Chandigarh's furniture since the 1990s, and why these pieces are commonly known as Jeanneret chairs in fancy auction houses and elite design spaces in the global north. While Pierre Jeanneret was not a hugely well-known architect in his own right, his cousin Le Corbusier was. And this was, of course, part of the reason that he ended up working on Chandigarh in the first place. But it's also this connection that, we suggest, makes attaching the Jeanneret name to the pieces a valuable exercise for dealers. We believe that the dealers who initially removed the furniture from Chandigarh traded on the renown and the quote-unquote value of Le Corbusier's name to increase the financial value of the Chandigarh chairs. By using the name Jeanneret in connection with these chairs, and only using the name Jeanneret, the Chandigarh pieces have been connected to the catalogue and the works of Le Corbusier, and through him to European modernism, both areas which are well known and very popular with rich design collectors. But of course, in the case of Chandigarh's furniture, this has literally meant ignoring, and we would suggest also suppressing, any credits to anyone else, even where credit is previously documented by the designers themselves. And here we're thinking in particular of this Marg article written by Chandigarh architect Urmila Yuli Chowdhury, which credits several pieces to the work of Indian architects. And this is in addition to anecdotal credit from Chandigarh architect Aditya Prakash, as well as contemporary literature from architectural historian Norma Evanson, which also mentions the full breadth of the design team. The consequences of this attribution whitewashing has been that the writing of Indian people out of design history, of Indian design. This has meant the remolding of a story of design in India as the story of the European design canon. It has been done to fetch bigger prices on the international art market that have existing value status for the European modernist design. This sort of whitewashing is incredibly apparent when we look at auction listings for Chandigarh's furniture. These sites explicitly refer to Chandigarh chairs as being Swiss, or as being French, or as being Swiss-French or French-Indian, and are almost entirely devoid of names of the furniture's Indian designers or makers. What we're seeing here is attribution by market forces, attribution of designed objects fundamentally shaped by the potential to create financial gain. And this sort of attribution, as we've shown with our Chandigarh chairs example, can mean the exclusion of large, important parts of the history of any given piece of design because they don't add financial value. And once this narrative becomes dominant, it also becomes extremely difficult to change. And so, that's the bad, but what about the good? How can this attribution be improved and be made fairer, and who should be getting the credit? Well, we might start by acknowledging and crediting the entire design team within which Pierre Jeanneret worked and which he led. And by this, we mean acknowledging all the members of the team, not just replacing the Jeanneret name with one other single name. Because, of course, by transferring the credit to another solitary designer, we risk repeating the same sort of hero worship which contributed to the exclusive Jeanneret attribution in the first place. Instead, we think it's really important to acknowledge the more shared and collaborative process through which design is made, and the fact that there is no conclusive evidence of exactly which person or people designed which pieces of Chandigarh's furniture. But we would also insist on going a number of steps further, because designed objects aren't just designed, they are also made. And while the initial conception of the furniture may have taken place within the architect's office, the actual manifestation of physical objects happened in carpentry workshops across Chandigarh, northern India, as these tags demonstrate. A really good sort of attribution of this furniture then would also acknowledge the nature of its production, that they were handmade by Indian carpenters in workshops across the region. This is important not only because it provides a more accurate and fairer picture of how these objects came into being, but also it begins to address the imbalance in the narrative which currently heavily favors design over production and use. And once again, you might be curious as to why we're telling you this, and why we think that the outcomes of bad historical writing are important to your design work today. As we've mentioned, single people taking credit for the work of a group is not only a historical phenomenon. Even today, many designers, often those in decision-making positions, happily continue to take the credit for the creative and technical abilities of the people working for them. Indeed, this is such a common phenomenon now that it seems almost natural that a building be credited to, say, Thomas Heatherwick, rather than his entire body of staff or contractor. Those left uncredited are most often the people on the quote-unquote lower rungs of the design industry, whose labour is seen as less valuable, often more manual, more technical, and perhaps considered less creative. The share of the work is often related to the actual physical creation of an object rather than its conception. And we find this division problematic and unjust because it marginalizes particular sections of society, effectively erasing their fully deserved contribution to design and design history. And we'll do our part as design historians to begin to correct this problem, to write differently about historical events, and to try and shift the conversation around attribution to a more just and more equitable one. But you'll be glad to hear that you come into this reformation too. As emerging designers and architects, you have the amazing opportunity of being able to start to challenge this one designer paradigm, of creating new practices, both inside and outside the studio, which acknowledge the contributions and creativity of the whole spectrums of individuals involved in design.
So use is the second big concept we keep coming back to in our work on the Chandigarh Chairs project. Use is what separates pieces of design from pieces of art. You can't really use a painting or a sculpture for practical, tangible applications. But items of design, whether they're a piece of clothing, a ceramic object, silverware, or yes, furniture, are defined by their use. We use them to do things in addition to appreciating their visual makeup. The centrality of use to the definition of design means, we think, that design historians, design commentators, and designers themselves need to pay extra attention to use as it pops up in different places and forms and guises. It is undeniable that the bulk of the history of Chandigarh's chairs lies in their use, in the ways they have been sat on and where, and for what purpose, in the ways they have been or they've not been repaired and repurposed and reused. These are objects that were expressly made to sit in, and so it is the sitting that deserves the lion's share of the attention. Beyond highlighting a need to focus on the ways of use, Chandigarh's modernist furniture raises a series of questions about design. Who were the chairs originally designed for? Who uses them now? What was supposed to happen to these pieces as they were worn and broken? Who should they belong to now? How should they be used now? And where would we even go to get answers to some of these questions? But these questions of use remain unasked and also unanswered in much of the literature and in the popular account of Chandigarh's furniture's history. We'd suggest that this is because the history of use, a history taking place exclusively within India and frequently by unknown normal people, doesn't add financial value to the objects. For example, an American celebrity like Kim Kardashian, who owns the chairs, was probably excited and willing to pay a lot of money for a set of furniture credited to a freshly rediscovered European architect, but probably would have been much less excited to purchase a set of furniture that had simply been sat on, being used by an Indian bureaucrat for nearly 50 years. Put another way, while international consumers of expensive modernist design are interested in objects from a Le Corbusier building or designed by or in proximity to the great man himself, there's a lot less of a market for the furniture of a Punjabi High Court official's chambers. Essentially, the popular narrative which avoids the topic of use leads to a story which begins and ends with the design of the furniture and the furniture's proximity to European modernism. But we would argue that if we add in the concept of use and all of the amazing questions and information that lead from this concept, we not only build a much more comprehensive history and understanding of the furniture, but we also begin to chip away at the Eurocentric grounds on which the removal of these pieces have been made. If it's a common understanding that the Chandigarh chairs were used and reused for almost half a decade, the narrative that they were undervalued in India begins to be challenged, and definitions of these objects as European begins to crumble. But the concept of use isn't just relevant to Chandigarh chairs. We believe that shifting the focus of design narratives towards considering the use of the objects is deeply important. Most broadly, thinking about use leads us as design historians, and hopefully you as architects and designers, to consider objects of design from the point of view of those they are intended for. In the case of Chandigarh chairs, for example, looking at the use of these objects fills in a whole host of information we couldn't gain just by looking at their design. How their comfort or discomfort affected the people who sat in them, how their design and visual appearance may have altered the spaces in which they were placed, how their material components went on to be used for other projects, facilitating other designs, how a need for repair of these chairs brought about additional jobs and expertise in the local economy. But thinking about use and users in the history of design also helps us to understand what happens when the intentions and ideology of designers meet the real world. Or in other words, exploring and thinking really carefully and critically about the past use of objects, and how these uses might differ from the designer's original intentions, moves the field towards a more democratic, accessible sort of design, which is relative to and reflexive of the things people really want and need, not just the things that designers think people need and think people should need.
And finally, we want to turn attention towards the very big idea of context of design. The idea that the objects that designers create don't just appear out of nowhere, as you all very well know. There's a whole slew of political, social, economic, and cultural pressures which influence not just what gets designed, but how we design it, how we receive it, and even what we think of as being possible to create in the first place. So when we're talking about the context of design, we're thinking about a whole bunch of separate but also interrelated pressures. We're talking about the history of the places where design is made, the reasons pieces are made and sold and used and resold and reused. We're talking about the networks through which objects of art and design are traded and by whom and for how much money. Specifically with regard to Chandigarh's modernist furniture, when we're thinking about and talking about context, we're referring to things like the inherent ulterior motives of the entire network of furniture sale and resale. We're thinking about the history and continuation of colonialism and racism, and the appropriation, oh boy, that was hard for some reason, of Indian art and design and culture as European products. In terms of context, we think about the extractive nature of global capitalism, of the destructive tendency to remove from the global south to enrich the global north. In terms of Chandigarh's modernist furniture, one of the statements that gets thrown out a lot in the fine art and antiques market, and that we've encountered quite a lot in this project, is that there was nothing wrong with the removal of furniture from Chandigarh because it was initially bought legally at a government auction. And if the French dealers hadn't purchased these pieces, the chairs would have been sold as scrap and quote unquote destroyed. And a lot of people take this statement completely at face value and uncritically repeat its message, like we can see here in the New York Times. But if we look at the context of India's relationship and history with Western Europe, the context of these chairs specifically, the context of the art market, and the context of the modernist design movement, we can start to begin to see why accepting these statements might not only be wrong, but also kind of dangerous in its own way. And we can start picking apart this statement with the context surrounding its use of the term legally, in the assertion that the furniture was legally purchased by the French dealers. And we hear this term a lot, especially as we're exploring the ideas of art crime and the Chandigarh's modernist furniture. Because despite the term legally being used quite confidently in a lot of places, there's actually a growing understanding within art crime circles and those discussing repatriation or return of objects about the impact and power and knowledge gaps in sales. Was this really a legally and morally sound sale if only one party understood the financial value the chairs could be sold for in the West and didn't communicate this information to the other party? Is it and should it really be legal for objects to be sold in such unequal exchanges? A lot of experts working historically, including ourselves, have strong reservations here. The discussion of power and knowledge imbalances is an important context for our understanding of the initial sale of the objects. The statement I referred to a couple minutes ago also implies that because the initial batch of chairs was bought at prices no one else was willing to pay, that this justifies their purchase by the French dealers and their subsequent removal from India. But this sort of dialogue masks the moral context and moral questions of extraction. Is it really okay for Europeans to remove objects at a low value in India, which they know can be assigned a high financial value in the West? Is it morally okay to remove objects which the dealers believed to have value and which they believed were important pieces of heritage from the people and places they were created for and to whose history they belong? And perhaps most importantly, are these actions really acceptable, especially given the fact that so much of the West's wealth, which these dealers relied on and tapped into for the purchases, was generated at the expense of the rest of the world and of India? We could then move on to the implicit argument in the statement that Chandigarh chairs becoming, as we keep referring to, scrap, in quotation marks, must be a bad thing. Here, the context of the design ecosystem within Chandigarh becomes important. If it was the original intention for this furniture to have an afterlife as wood, as we are told and as the dealers seem to concede, then why does its eventual end life of this furniture as raw wood product have to be so terrible? Isn't this sort of recycling and reuse a more environmentally friendly and frankly holistic approach to design? Isn't it the sort of ecosystem that we should all be looking towards and moving towards as we move further into climate collapse? This leads to the implicit understanding of value in the statement, that chairs being sold as quote unquote scrap indicates that they were not being valued within Chandigarh. But value is an incredibly subjective concept, and this statement only touches upon one context of value, that of financial value, at the expense of any other context and any other understandings. We're told that no one valued the furniture in Chandigarh and shown pictures like the ones you're seeing now, which are in the dealer's very prominent book, to substantiate these claims. Yet we would argue that these pieces were valued for their use and for their design, while also still having resale value, just not as a piece of high design. We think that the context of the chair's use indicates a strong culture and ethos of value and appreciation within Chandigarh. And furthermore, what's the difference between the Chandigarh government storing its old municipal furniture in piles and officials in New York City doing the same? Here you see an image I took in New York a few months ago of old school furniture piled up within a school's courtyard. It's been roped off by the police. It's been haphazardly stacked. It's a caution hazard. Does this mean that New Yorkers or Americans don't value design and design history? Or does it indicate that this is a really common way of dealing with old municipal furniture? We're ending this talk with the concept of context because we believe it's such a huge and hugely important one. we can't write good design histories, we can't understand the past and the present, and we can't build a just and equitable future if we don't think long and hard and critically about context, about the forces acting on us and on our designs and on our design and production systems. And we think this applies to your work as architects and designers as well. It's so important to think and really think carefully and critically about our place in global socioeconomic systems and what happens to designs and the narrative of designs once they leave the studio. A very pertinent and much more recent example here might be the case of the architect Zaha Hadid and her perhaps entirely indefensible comments regarding the design of her 2022 World Cup stadium in Qatar. In response to questions about the deaths of potentially hundreds of migrant workers during the construction of her stadium, Hadid asserted that it's not my duty as an architect to look at it. I cannot do anything about it because I have no power to do anything about it. I think it's a problem anywhere in the world. And that was an exact quote. With a good knowledge of context, Hadid would know, for starters, that the deaths of scores of workers in the construction of buildings is not, in fact, a problem anywhere in the world. With a good knowledge of geopolitical context, Hadid would have known that labor abuses and deaths were rife in Qatar, and that it was unlikely the building could have been built in an ethical and humane way. With knowledge and appreciation and mobilization of context, Hadid could have refused to design a building that could not be completed without causing human suffering. Context is important because knowing context and not being afraid to dive into some really complex and hard issues and topics means that we all can situate designs and our work in a way that reflects our values and the way we want the world to see us and the way we want the world to be. And it also helps you to avoid being a negative anecdote in someone else's lecture like Zaha Hadid is here.
And as a very brief conclusion, before hopefully we all have a good Q&A and a bit of a chat, we think that these three elements of attribution, use, and context can begin to flesh out not just design histories, but the design process, making us think more about the whys of design. Why things look a certain way, why they're used in a certain way, and why people seem to be far more interested in some elements of design rather than others, and what the real significance of all of our work as designers and design historians might actually be. Our final pitch then, that the Chandigarh Chairs themselves, but also the broader public conception and understanding of the chairs, have been shaped by the crucible of attribution, use, and context. And by understanding these, we better understand the pieces themselves and can design better pieces in future. And very finally, we all hope that this has been an interesting 40 or so minutes for all of you, that there's been something that each of you can take away from the lecture to dwell on today and in the future. Thank you.